So our next presenter is our next to last presenter. I'd be the last one, so don't leave me yet. So our next presenter is a good friend of mine. I'm super happy that he was able to join us today. Nick Powers is Curator of Collections at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia. A native of the Shenandoah Valley, Powers graduated from James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia in 2011 with a degree in history. In 2014, he graduated from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. At MSV, Powers researches, exhibits, and lectures on the museum's collections of Shenandoah Valley fine, decorative, folk, and self-taught art, the collection of American, European, and Asian art assembled by museum benefactor Julian Wood Glass Jr., and the queer and other history associated with Glen Burnie, the historic farm that today centers the museum of the Shenandoah Valley campus. Powers is the author of multiple articles and museum blogs on Shenandoah Valley and Southern decorative arts and material culture. He's also a contract editor for the Journal of Early Southern Decorative Arts, published by MESDA, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, and Old Salem Museums, and also the Gardens in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So if everyone could join me in giving Nick a big round of applause.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to everybody here at the Guild for having me to this great conference. I'm going to warn you a little bit ahead of time. Sorry if I sound a little bit stuffy. I have a sinus infection. I swear it's only a sinus infection. So clearly I need some of that kudzu, I guess, for the health benefits. But I'm really happy to be here today to try to recenter the Shenandoah Valley as an integral part of, and a contributor to the early Southern Highland craft revival. There we go. Many people have really different understandings of what the Shenandoah Valley is, so for clarity's sake, before we get too far, I want to first say I'm going to be following our definition at the MSV of the Shenandoah Valley of 8 counties in Virginia, but also 2 counties, Jefferson and Berkeley, in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. So essentially what is today the region from Harper's Ferry south to Natural Bridge. But the Shenandoah Valley also represents the northern fringes of the Southern Appalachian region as defined by Alan Eaton, but it's often left out of or minimized in discussions about the craft revival. I think there's some valid reasons for that exclusion. Rather than looking inward into the state, at some of the rural cultural traditions of the valley, parts of the valley, including mine in the Winchester area, looked more to the industrial tenets of the New South with textile production like this, the Virginia Woolen Mill in Winchester, where my own maternal grandmother was a burler for many years. And when Valley people did finally start responding to the craft revival, it was much later than other parts of Appalachia, especially down here. So for example, in 1942, Alice Andrews, who ran a Southern Highland Craft Guild shop in Shenandoah National Park, which we'll talk more about in just a couple of minutes. When she was interviewed by the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper, she said that, quote, Virginia has been far behind its neighboring states in the revival of mountain handcrafts. Actually, there's practically no end to what these people can do if they set their minds to it. So nevertheless, the Valley did still participate in the craft revival, and that participation was not monolithic. A variety of organizations, enterprises, and individual craftspeople were part of the revival in their own ways. Some were direct offshoots of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, as well as some of its earlier incarnations. Some were loosely affiliated makers with individual memberships with the guild, and some were completely independent, especially one that I'll talk a little bit later towards the end that has connections to my family. But I wanted to start with guild-related efforts since we are here today. The guild's impact on the craft revival in the Valley is really inexorably linked with the rise in the early 20th century of automobile tourism and the founding and the administration of Shenandoah National Park, which originally was intended to connect to both the Great Smoky Mountains National Park via the Blue Ridge Parkway. We have a little bit of that, but not quite what was originally intended. The intricacies and the betrayals of the formation of Shenandoah National Park, that's a talk completely in its own right, and there's some great books being published about that now. But in short, rural tourism in land that became part of the park really began in the late 19th century. For example, in 1894, probably the best word to describe him is a bombastic promoter of sorts, George Freeman Pollock, who we can see here on the left. He founded what Skyland Resorts, what became Skyland Resort to attract vacationers coming from DC. Pollock could be a talk in and of himself, leading mule tours up through the mountains and also waking up visitors to Skyland with a bugle call every morning. He's a really interesting guy. But in 1926, Congress authorized the park under the condition that no federal funds could be used to purchase the land. So to meet that requirement, in 1928, the Virginia legislature passed the Blanket Condemnation Act to condemn and purchase land to turn over to the federal government. And the CCC began construction of the Skyline Drive in the early 1930s, with Roosevelt eventually dedicating the park in front of 5,000 people at Big Meadows in 1936. But what's lesser known, but is still really bitterly felt by descendants even today, and gaining more attention in recent years, was the forced relocation of more than 2,000 people, representing 465 families living on what became parkland. More than half those families did not actually own the land they lived on, but had lived on that land for generations, meaning that they did not qualify for compensation. And newspaper articles in the Washington Post and books like Hollerfolk in 1933, it's a familiar story down here, examining interrelated families in Corbin and Nicholson Hollows, typecast these mountain people as backward, disadvantaged, and undereducated, for whom relocation could only be a benefit. But in reality, flying in the face of those stereotypes were people in this area writing all the way to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asking him to intervene, and also cases like the one that'll be popping up on the screen here of Melancton Kleiser of Luray in Page County, who was evicted from his home in 1935. He owned a very successful filling station as well as a luncheon. And sadly, many of the people who produced handcrafts in what became the park property were expelled from a region that then is going to go on to extol their work quite a bit. But guild representation takes the form of two shops in the Shenandoah National Park showcasing the crafts of members. One was at Big Meadows and one was at Skyland, we just talked about, established in the 1890s by Pollock. And Skyland is the heart of the park now, just as it was in that period. And while they were open collectively for over 20 years, first experimentally in the 1930s and then consistently from 1941 through 1963, the Shenandoah Park endeavors are really unique in guild history because only in the instance of the Shenandoah operations was the guild forced to contract through intermediaries, rather than negotiating directly with park representatives like at Great Smokies, the Blue Ridge Parkway, Mammoth Cave. And really in Shenandoah, the handicrafts were largely tied more to profit sales and not coupled so much with educational interpretation of craft history. And this is probably because of Virginia backroom politics in this period, typified by the bird machine. Pictured on the screen is Harry Flood Bird, Virginia senator and also one-time governor, who also organized massive resistance against segregation, in support of segregation a little bit later on. But in 1937, the park was awarded, the contract for the long-term franchise sales of all merchandise in the park was awarded to the Virginia Skyline Company, which was based in Richmond, not in the Shenandoah Valley itself or even in the Blue Ridge. And looking at some of the guild minutes that Matt has very kindly shared with me from some of his research here, there's this constant tension between the Skyline Company and the guild throughout its entire term of operation. But almost immediately, the guild has a presence here, partially because the Skyline Company in the first year of their tenure doesn't make any money. 1937, they kind of fall flat on their faces, so they then turn to the guild and invite the guild to use, quote, the gift shop off from the dining room, which had been a failure for them the first year. So they kind of squeeze them in a little bit, but it's not really directly stated, but most likely this was probably at somewhere in Big Meadows, where much of those early park efforts were concentrated. But by 1940, the experimental phase evolved into the opportunity for more structured leasing opportunities. In meeting minutes from some of these early years, the Guild Board expressed concern that the terms from the Skyline Company were not as favorable as they should be, but that passing on the offer would forfeit any opportunities for further markets in national parks. The board also couched the prospective shop in terms of promoting their mission, calling it, quote, a challenge for the education of the consumer. It is an opportunity to show the difference between the real handicrafts and junk, to bring our market to the sympathetic interest of the public. So the shop at Big Meadows, where Roosevelt dedicated the park in 1936, was the first of the two Guild lease locations to open during the 1941 season. And these photos on the screen behind me are from an article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper at the time showing the opening of that shop in a log and fieldstone building that housed it. And that same article also included this promotional image on the right where this couple looking in through the window. And you can see things like rag dolls, corn shuck dolls, souvenir boutonnieres, towels, napkins, rugs, scarves, neckties, chairs, corncob pipes. But also I didn't want you to miss, it's a little hard to see, but if you look on the muntins of the windows, there are little animal carvings that are probably the work of Brasstown at the Campbell School. You know, and the newspaper goes on to mention some other objects that were carried there. What it doesn't clarify is if any of these crafts were made by people who had been expelled from the park, but some of whom still lived in the area and had turned towards craft production. Just a year after opening, the Big Meadow store closes. It's 1942. World War II has broken out, and gas rationing makes travel for most Americans pretty unfeasible. But upon reopening in 1946, Big Meadows sees one of its biggest upsurges in visitation and sales because of that post-war euphoria. And by 1950, the Guild meeting minutes indicate that the second location at Skyland had opened. And by the 1950s, we start seeing reasonably steady sales, but also increased competition. So by 1956, the Virginia Skyline Company, running in Richmond, had established two shops of their own that did carry some of the work of Guild members, but these shops were not operated by the Guild themselves. One of them was Panorama, right here, which was kind of positioned at the eastern edge of the park, which means that it was poised to capture a lot of the traffic coming from urban centers like Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia Beach, things like that. And the other one was at Deer Lick, but it doesn't exactly say where that shop was, and Deer Lick is one of the most common names for small places in the Shenandoah Valley, making it a little hard to trace. But really, there's this kind of small window in 1959 when the original Panorama building is torn down that kind of stops the bleeding for a short time, but by within a few months to a year, that building was back up and running and fighting against the Guild shops. Things had begun looking up by 1962 when the Guild negotiated a better contract with Skyline that they believed would double their income. But the death knell really comes in 1963 when studies made by the Interior Department and the National Park Service result in a decision to eliminate subcontract concessions operations unless they are essential to providing better facilities and services to that of the sub-concessioner. So the Guild is pretty much out of business in Shenandoah Park as of October 1st, 1963. But really, kind of the board acknowledged the necessity of that decision. In 1962, after a sales volume of $60,000, the Guild netted $600. So they were not all that displeased to hand over all concessions to the Skyline Company, and it was acknowledged that Skyline would continue to provide a market for some Guild producers. And throughout the Guild's tenure in Shenandoah, their shops also competed with some of those regional makers who were displaced by the park, but who remained nearby or who had negotiated life rights to live within it. And one of those cases was the woman on the left-hand side of this image, Estelle Nicholson, later Dodson. James Madison University, my alumnus, has done a great job trying to capture oral histories of some of the people that lived in the park. And the Nicholsons were part of a large network of interconnected parkland families who practiced traditional white oak basket making. Here you can see a photo of Estelle's father, Eddie Nicholson, who wove baskets in Corbin Hollow that the daughters in the family, who were probably more sympathetic than the boys, would carry up the 5 to 6 mile route from the Hollow to Skyland to sell. And some of the minutes from and reports from people running the shops talk about how much of a problem it is that people who were local were coming up to visitors in the parking lots trying to sell baskets. Other families like the Prices and the Cooks set up basket stands on roads leading into the park to capture business, and this is kind of a practice that really continued from the 1920s well through much of the park's era. So the saga of the craft revival in Shenandoah National Park, it's a really important one, but it's also not the only story of craft revival in the Shenandoah Valley. Other endeavors arose independent of the Guild at around the same time, though it's possible that the movers and shakers in some of these endeavors were Guild members. I'd like to look more into that. But one of the most important was the Shenandoah community workers, who are better known as Bird Haven in Shenandoah County, which has gone chronically understudied. From 1927 until 1964, with some northern funding, the community at Bird Haven formed to give members education in craftsmanship, develop practical methods of applied forestry, and also reinvest profits back into the community, initially intended to just survive the Great Depression. So as you can see here, Bird Haven is in the western part of Shenandoah County, very near the West Virginia border, and not too far from Shenandoah National Park itself. Economic development in the area jump-started in the late 19th century with the founding of the building behind me, Shenandoah Alum Springs Hotel, near Orkney Springs, where the Shenandoah Valley Music Festival is held today. Very much similar to Skyland that we had talked about just a couple of minutes ago, attracting vacationers from Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, but a fire at the hotel and then also rumors of arsenic in the spring water really kind of shied people away from the resort and greatly impacted the livelihoods of people in the area. So the idea for a craft community at Bird Haven emerged in 1927 with the financial backing of a Philadelphia businessman, William Bernard Clark. And accounts really differ about whether Clark visited the area on a hunting trip or if his grandmother had previously purchased land near Bird Haven. I don't quite know yet, but he did eventually choose to live at Bird Haven to really support the efforts of what was going on there. Probably in this house, which is one of the few that's still standing at the Bird Haven site. But members of the Shenandoah community workers were paid from a common fund, with the remainder going towards improving conditions and constructing or retrofitting buildings into a carpenter shop, a paint shop, a drying kiln, blacksmith shop, show building, and later a post office that we'll talk about. And in these spaces, the Shenandoah community workers, they produced furniture, salad bowls and utensils, other turned objects, toys, puzzles, textiles, brooms, baskets, and wrought ironwork. And from some of their earliest days this is the era of the New Deal, the Richmond newspapers, which is kind of pushing back against Roosevelt, they start referring to Bird Haven as the first Virginia Soviet. And in many of these newspaper interviews, spokespeople for Bird Haven presented it as an independent community of hardy mountaineers who were untouched by the modern age, instead hearkening back to heirloom objects that were brought down from the mountain cabins as examples of pure design to emulate. In a 1931 article, which you can see on the right, it ends with the declaration that the machine age shall never enter our workshops. And another of Bird Haven's mantras was industry without industrialization, which is where the title of my talk comes from. Presented, alongside idealized images like this one of a Bird Haven craftsman who is polishing a dough trough, and around him is a walking wheel, a yarn winder Swift, the spinning wheel, and then kind of hiding on a table back here are a couple of coal baskets, very similar to others produced in Shenandoah County. The reality of craft production at Bird Haven, really, it's much, much different, and it fully embraced industrial technology. For example, animal toys, and some of which you can see here on the screen, designed for Bird Haven by the nationally known children's author John Martin. These were called Little Beasties. They were some of Bird Haven's most popular products, and women in the paint house decorated these toys with electrically run compressed air paint brushes. And actually, in some of the oral interviews that have been done about Bird Haven, some of these paints and the brushes were suspected of causing cancer in some of the women who were working in this shop. But this isn't to say that the workers at Bird Haven didn't also produce, quote unquote, traditional handcrafted objects. Labor was generally gendered at Bird Haven. In addition to working in the paint house, women at Bird Haven produced hooked rugs like this one with motifs from children's book published in the 1930s. Bird Haven workers also adapted traditional forms for modern life, and a good example is this cradle form that has dowels running horizontally through it that magically turns it into a magazine rack. They were also making cobblers' benches as side tables. And under the guidance of rangers from Shenandoah National Park, the Shenandoah community workers very carefully selected walnut, maple, yellow pine, which they called bull pine, trees to craft their wooden wares, in a really interesting example of privatized applied forestry. But ironically, at the same time that these park rangers are helping the community at Bird Haven, they're also tearing down the mountain homesteads of people that had lived in Shenandoah National Park to give this illusion of an unpeopled forest. So it's kind of an interesting, era of contradictions here. But increasingly, Bird Haven also developed product lines designed specifically for modern living. One of the examples that I really wasn't expecting to find are these lazy back chairs designed for shipboard use with hardwood frames, canvas backs, and seats and straps to adjust the incline. And they also made objects like this, this abstract turned maple bowl. This would fit into the aesthetic of any 1950s American kitchen. And also, just incidentally, most of the bowls have these stickers or a brand that's almost identical. That's one of the most easy ways to identify Bird Haven pieces. And also teaching the workers at Bird Haven were designers and makers at the forefront of American taste. So for example, the master metalwork designer and blacksmith Samuel Yellen in Philadelphia, probably there are those Clark connections coming through again, visited Bird Haven for a week sometime in the 1930s. And kind of neither were Bird Haven products particularly intended for local or regional consumption. Certainly, locals did buy from the Shenandoah community workers. Objects do pop up at auctions. Actually, I was looking, there are a few coming up in just a couple of weeks in the valley, and other tourist locations like Endless Caverns behind me in Newmarket operated a showroom for Bird Haven products as of 1934. But 80% of sales for Bird Haven were mail order, to the point that they built a post office attached to the display house to meet this national demand for handcrafted objects, kind of maybe regardless of where they might have actually been originating, and the regionalism associated with it. I have tracked Bird Haven advertisements as far west as California newspapers, as far north as Buffalo, as far south as Columbia, South Carolina. And then all of a sudden it kind of just disappeared. In 1964, Bird Haven closed very suddenly, with tools literally left right where the workers had walked away from them. And unfortunately, Bird Haven has not been studied closely enough yet to really determine what the root causes were. Some of the few oral interviews that have been taken with people who worked there suggest that as demand suffered, wages could not catch up with modern living. And Bird Haven sat pretty well empty for decades until the 20-teens, when it was purchased by new owners who've tried to save and restore as much of it as possible with the intent to turn it into a community center and an educational venue. But Bird Haven is a really interesting example of Valley attempts at fusing craft revival with social welfare, one that deserves much more attention. And then finally, the last case study that I'd like to share with you today is actually one to which my family is very closely connected. From approximately 1927 until 1933, the Round Hill pottery west of Winchester, where I live and where the MSV is, attempted to, in their own words, revive the pottery industry of the Shenandoah Valley. And my great-great-uncle, Richard Saunders Jolliffe, a World War I veteran and a siding salesman, two very different things, took the lead on marketing the pottery's wares to the point that today, locally, the pieces from the Round Hill pottery are often colloquially referred to as Jolliffe pottery. Richard and his business partners, his wife, Laura Baker Jolliffe, and his employer, E.W. Armstrong, they did not originally set out to have any intentions of creating a pottery industry in this part of the valley. Instead, they, in 1927, purchased land west of Winchester with the intention of constructing mountain cabins for vacationers. Does this sound familiar by this point? But when digging a pond for the site, Richard found large deposits of clay suitable for pottery making. And to capitalize on their discovery, the partners turned towards what remained of the valley pottery industry. In the 19th century, pottery production thrived throughout the Shenandoah Valley, particularly in the town of Strasburg in Shenandoah County, which was known as Pot Town, where literally tens of thousands of gallons of ceramics were exported via rail lines built and then rebuilt after the Civil War. But the adoption of glass jars and canneries in the early 20th century really brought an end to the valley's golden age of ceramics, and even fewer potters were still living by the 1920s. So enter Theodore Thede Fleet, who came from a storied pottery-making family. His father, Lorenzo, worked for multiple Shenandoah Valley potteries, including the mid-19th century shop of emigre German potter Anthony Bacher, whose work is pictured behind me here, who arguably produced some of the earliest and the best art pottery forms in Valley ceramics history. Lorenzo later worked for multiple potters in Strasburg, with Thede probably learning at his knee. And as a young man, in about 1889, excuse me, Thede also spent time working in Tennessee at the Charles Decker Pottery in Truckee Valley. But in 1927, Thede was 61 years old, but he brought a huge wealth of accumulated knowledge to the Round Hill pottery. Fleet and the business partners began transforming the Round Hill pottery into a production pottery by building a pug mill to grind clay, and also built an updraft kiln to fire vessels. I'd just like to point out these two photographs were actually taken by my great-grandfather, who was Richard's brother and a professional photographer. So I recently moved into my grandmother's old house last year, and we found some really interesting things, including photographs. But Fleet was really traditionally following some Shenandoah Valley forms that you would expect to see. This is another photograph by my great-grandfather of Thede throwing pottery inside of the throwing shed, and this little kind of squat pot with straight sides is very similar to pieces made by Mennonite potters in Rockingham County, Virginia, in the Central Valley in the mid-19th century. And Fleet was also repeating forms that he had seen at the Decker pottery, like this pair of porch vases with very squat bases and these kind of elongated and flowing spouts. Round Hill, though, did produce what, as far as I know, is the kind of the earliest and some of the few examples of art pottery in the 20th Century Valley, exemplified by pieces like this one, which I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it is, whether it's a batter pitcher or possibly the ugliest teapot you've ever seen. Richard might have also been making pieces. There's some oral histories that ones like this one were his work, despite the fact that he was not trained in pottery. But most pieces are, at least early on, are marked just with Winchester, Virginia on the body or somewhere on the bottom. But sometime by the 1930s, they began adopting a apple stamp to try and market those pieces as part of the new Apple Blossom Festival, which was founded in 1924, still runs each May today. The Apple Blossom Festival was conceived not so much as a folk festival, but as a promotional pageant complete with celebrities, a queen, and a court. We can see it in this next slide, Patsy Cline riding along Main Street with the goal of increasing tourism to the Northern Valley's really booming post-World War I apple industry. And Richard was in a perfect position to combine some of these efforts. He not only marketed the Round Hill pottery, he also served on the guidance committee for the Apple Blossom Festival, so he had an opportunity to double dip a little bit. And in my grandparents' papers, I was fascinated to find photo negatives by his brother Lawrence, like this one, where we can see Round Hill pottery pieces paired with Shenandoah Valley apples, trying to link those two. And like with Birdhaven, though, the distribution of Round Hill pottery wasn't necessarily in this part of the Shenandoah Valley where they were made. Quite often they show up in West Virginia, Maryland, southern Pennsylvania, where Richard Jolliffe was traveling as both a siding salesman and an advance agent for the Apple Blossom Festival. And by the 1930s, Jolliffe was considering expanding the Round Hill pottery into producing whiteware and focusing the pottery on reviving the industry in the valley. He writes this letter where he's asking for resources from the federal government, and in the letter back, the person from the government says, I understand you are interested in reviving this industry, but like with so many of these other efforts, the Great Depression really takes its toll, and by about 1933, the Round Hill pottery had closed with more of a whimper than a shout. The stories of Shenandoah National Park, Birdhaven, and the Round Hill pottery, they reveal that the craft revival movement in the Shenandoah Valley, it was one of experimentation and change, as diverse as the people who championed it. Many of the people who contributed to the valley's participation in the revival and the objects that they left behind, they've really gone unrecognized until fairly recently. But it's my hope that this talk is the beginnings of trying to recover some of this history and also reconnecting the Shenandoah Valley with the Guild. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking with you more.